During World War II, Roosevelt and Churchill came together in 1941 and created the Atlantic Charter. One of the 8 principal points of that charter was the right of self-determination. That concept, which is also supported by the United Nations, states that people, based on respect for the principle of equal rights and fair equality of opportunity, have the right to freely choose their sovereignty and international political status with no interference. Self-determination has since come to mean the free choice of one's own acts without external compulsion. So now let me tie that same concept to Kwanzaa. After World War II, many Black workers and their families migrated to the West Coast from the South. They were looking not only for better jobs, but also better education, and they were fleeing segregation, Jim Crow laws, violence, and racial bigotry. Sadly, California and Los Angeles weren't particularly welcoming. Los Angeles had racially restrictive covenants that prevented specific minorities from renting and buying properties long after courts had ruled these practices were illegal, even after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Many of these Blacks were World War II veterans, and after serving their country, fighting for freedom, they were denied freedom here in their own country. Due to the influence of Southern lawmakers, the GI Bill was crafted primarily to benefit whites and help as few Blacks as possible by ensuring states and not the federal government administered the law. In fact, Blacks had a far more difficult time securing any of the GI Bill benefits. So, amidst racial segregation, unjust treatment of Blacks in education, employment, and fair housing, and 20 years of unjust treatment after World War II, things finally came to a climax. In August of 1965, an African-American man was pulled over for reckless driving in Los Angeles. Witnesses claimed the police used excessive force while arresting the man, his mother, and his brother. Witnesses also claimed that police kicked a pregnant woman. One thing led to another, and what we now call the Watts riots took place all over Los Angeles over the next 6 days. Many in the Black community, however, believed the rioters were taking part in an uprising against an oppressive system. In a 1966 essay, Black civil rights activist Bayard Rustin wrote, "The whole point of the outbreak in Watts was that it marked the first major rebellion of Blacks and was carried on with the express purpose of asserting that they would no longer quietly submit to the deprivation of slum life." Despite allegations that criminal elements were responsible for the riots, the vast majority of those arrested had no prior criminal record. In 1966, after the Watts riots, Dr. Malena Karenga, professor and chair of Black Studies at California State University, searched for ways to bring African Americans together as a community. Dr. Karenga ultimately created Kwanzaa and its 7 principles, one principle celebrated on each of the 7 days of Kwanzaa. These principles are unity, self-determination, collective work and responsibility, cooperative economics, purpose, creativity, and lastly, faith. Today, on the 2nd day of Kwanzaa, we celebrate and honor the principle of self-determination, the free choice of one's own acts without external compulsion. Dr. Karenga defined self-determination in the following way, specifically for African Americans. He said, "We must define ourselves, name ourselves, create for ourselves, and speak for ourselves." And to that, I would add, Black Lives Matter and self-determination matters. Today, besides the history I've just provided, I plan to share how the ideals of Kwanzaa are reflected in the actions of some prominent African Americans, and how those actions have led to significant changes in our society. I, for one, applaud and appreciate those actions and those changes. So that you don't think this is just a political sermon, I'll simply remind you of our second principle: justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And quite frankly, that justice I just mentioned doesn't always happen. It often takes a great deal of effort to spur it on. The first African American I'll talk about spoke for his community, and like it or not, the whole world heard and reacted. As expected, however, that "speak for ourselves" mantra proclaimed by Dr. Karenga has often been a problem for white privilege in our country. Those who are in power don't want to hear a narrative not of their fabrication. In 2016, Colin Kaepernick sat during the playing of the US national anthem prior to the football game, rather than stand as is customary, as a protest against racial injustice, police brutality, and systemic oppression in the country. The following week, and throughout the remainder of the regular season, Kaepernick kneeled during the anthem. The protest received highly polarized reactions, with some praising him and his protest against racism, and others denouncing him and his protests. The actions resulted in a wider protest movement, which intensified in September 2017 after President Donald Trump said that the NFL owners should fire players who protest during the national anthem. Kaepernick became a free agent after the season ended, and to this day remains unsigned, which many have attributed to political reasons. In November of 2017, he filed a grievance against the NFL and its owners, accusing them of colluding to keep him out of the league. Kaepernick withdrew his grievance in February of 2019 after reaching a confidential settlement with the NFL. His protest received renewed attention in 2020 amid the George Floyd protests against police brutality and racism. White privilege, in my opinion, has kept Colin Kaepernick from playing football simply because he spoke out against the ongoing injustice currently being perpetrated on the African American community. But it's not kept him from speaking truth, very uncomfortable truth, to power, mostly white privilege and white power. According to the Black Lives Matter website, Black Lives Matter is an ideological and political intervention in a world where Black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise. It is an affirmation of Black folks' humanity, our contributions to this society, and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression. Those words also echo my earlier definition of self-determination, which has come to mean the free choice of one's own acts without external compulsion. In fact, external compulsion sought to silence Colin Kaepernick because of his objection to the deadly oppression inflicted on the Black community. Kaepernick possibly took those words to heart when he decided to kneel during the national anthem in September of 2016. At previous game, he had gained attention for sitting in protest of state-sanctioned oppression. He turned to kneeling in order to support the Black Lives Matter movement with a positive message that emphasizes progress and respect rather than divisiveness. Kaepernick's decision to kneel came about after conversations with a former Green Beret named Nate Boyer, who was initially angered by Kaepernick's sit-downs. After meeting with Kaepernick, Boyer voiced support for efforts to raise awareness about persistent structural racism in the U.S. Today, things are vastly different in professional sports, all because of what Kaepernick helped ignite. Since landing in Orlando as part of the NBA's return to play, Philadelphia 76ers forward Tobias Harris has spoken to the media about precisely one thing: justice for Breonna Taylor. In contrast to the NFL's treatment of Kaepernick, Harris has the support of his team and the NBA for his efforts to bring public attention to the death of Taylor, who was unarmed and shot in her bed at night during a no-knock police raid. The NBA plastered Black Lives Matter on the game court in Walt Disney World in Orlando. The NBA also approved 29 statements, such as "Say Their Names" and "I Can't Breathe," for players to wear on their jerseys in Orlando once official games began. Major League Baseball teams also leveraged opening day publicity to draw attention to the Black Lives Matter movement. A new wave of activism included the participation of the New York Yankees and Washington Nationals, in addition to the Los Angeles Dodgers and San Francisco Giants. Every player and coach on all four teams assembled and kneeled along with their respective foul lines with long black ribbons prior to their games. The facts are clear. Colin Kaepernick's protests matter. Black lives matter. And self-determination matters. And a unified community fighting against oppression has made a profound impact on the world all around us. James Cone, a famous African-American theologian, said, "Testimony is an integral part of the Black religious tradition. It is the occasion where the believer stands before the community of faith in order to give account of the hope that is in him or her." Colin Kaepernick was the believer, and in his case, kneeling before the community. And his courageous acts are creating hope for a community long oppressed by white privilege. Thank you, Colin Kaepernick. Now on to another courageous member of the African American community. And here too, I'll remind you of another of our principles, which states the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process in society at large. But first, another reminder of the words of Dr. Karenga about self-determination, where he called the African American community to define, name, create, and speak for themselves. However, one of the best ways to limit the force of collective voices and their own self-determination is to stifle the power of votes, which ultimately directs the course of all elections and the people who run our government. Stifling votes is a direct attack on the democratic process we claim to champion. Voter suppression in all its forms has hit the African American community especially hard. In 2018, Stacey Abrams lost her bid to be the governor of Georgia, likely because of voter suppression. Georgia's 2018 elections shone a bright light on the issue with elections that were rife with mismanagement, irregularities, unbelievably long lines, and more, exposing both recent and also decades-long actions and inactions by the state to thwart the right to vote. After witnessing the gross mismanagement of the 2018 election by the Secretary of State's office, Abrams launched a nonprofit called Fair Fight to ensure every American has a voice in our election system through programs such as Fair Fight 2020, an initiative to fund and train voter teams in 20 battleground states. Over the course of her career, Abrams has founded multiple organizations devoted to voting rights, training and hiring young people of color, and tackling social issues at both the state and national levels. Fair Fight's efforts paid off. In Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, a large majority of Black eligible voters live in each of the state's largest metro areas. Biden won Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, all battleground states. Dr. Rashawn Ray, a fellow of governance studies at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., shares the following in his article titled, "How Black Americans Saved Biden and American Democracy." Exit poll data from the 2020 election show the power of the Black vote. Black Americans represented over 50% of all Democratic voters in Georgia, 20% of all Democratic voters in Michigan, and 21% of all Democratic voters in Pennsylvania. And 2020 is not an anomaly. Black voters have long pulled their relative weight to other social groups. In most battleground states, a majority of Black Americans live in metro areas, including Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Milwaukee, Phoenix, and Atlanta. Black voters in each of those cities actually voted in higher numbers, helping to secure wins for Biden in each of their respective states. But the role of Black Americans goes way beyond helping candidate Biden secure a presidential victory. With Trump's divisive rhetoric, overt appeals to systemic racism, use of outright falsehood and distortions, and attempts to overrun the 2020 election through extra-legal maneuvers, Blacks helped to save American democracy. They enabled Democrats to overcome the appeals of a GOP leader intent on subverting long-held democratic institutions and ushering in an era of authoritarian rule. A second Trump term likely would have featured more catastrophic attacks on the opposition, including delegitimizing civil society organizations and packing the judiciary with even more loyalists. 8 years of Trump rule would have destroyed American democracy and altered the future of the country and the world. Dr. Ray says explicitly, growing up in the Atlanta metro area, I know the legacy and current realities of voter suppression, police brutality, racial segregation, and white supremacy. I share a collective memory with other Blacks of electoral tactics that kept the black vote down and prevented Stacey Abrams from becoming governor just 2 years ago. As a kid, I remember visiting Stone Mountain for 4th of July and witnessing the most amazing laser light display that I have ever seen. As I got older, I realized that light show was celebrating Confederate generals who aimed to keep my ancestors on plantations and in shackles. This is why the political mobilization of Stacey Abrams, civic organizations, and Black Lives Matter activists is so remarkable, both for the 2020 election and American democracy. It is clear rallying cries about systemic racism and a potentially better and more equitable America were heard loud and clear by many voters. Without a doubt, the contributions Stacey Abrams made to secure a free and fair election for us all simply can't be overstated. I'll close today once again referencing the profound words of the distinguished professor of theology, Dr. James Cone, who said, "To sing about freedom and to pray for its coming is not enough. Freedom must be actualized in history by oppressed peoples who accept the intellectual challenge to analyze the world for the purpose of changing it." So, to Colin Kaepernick and Stacey Abrams, I say thanks for taking on the challenges, changing the world as we know it, and saving democracy for us all. Amen and namaste.